Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome to you all, and welcome to the summer school lecture series. You probably have been attending this series for many years, and it's been wonderful that we have such a good attendance this afternoon. And it's always great for the university to be able to be partner of hosting such events, and also to bring some aspects that's been happening in the university closer to the public. So I'm Francis Peterson, I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the university, and it's really for me an honor not only to welcome you, but to welcome our speaker this afternoon. Our speaker is John Compton, and I'm just going to give a very brief background of John. John has been at the University of Cape Town for almost 20 years, where he has pursued a broad range of research topics related to Earth history, past climates, environments, and processes. He has been a particular interest in, or has been involved and had a particular interest in geoarchaeology and the role of past climates, specifically in relation to human evolution. He also has been involved in studies of marine geology and the history of the Benguela upwelling on the west coast, and the role of dust in supplying nutrients to the fynbos ecosystem. More recently, he has become interested in the role of Pleistocene climate change on sea level, fluctuations in the evolution of humans in southern Africa. He also published a popular science book called The Rocks and Mountains of Cape Town. And I think with this diverse range of research interest, it is clear to me and hopefully also to you that John Compton is the right person to speak on the topic human origins, how diet, climate, and landscape shaped us. John, over to you.
Thank you.
Great, yeah. Thanks, Francis, for the introduction. And welcome, everybody. Some of you might remember me. I hope I might remember some of you from summer school a long time ago when I talked about the book mentioned, The Rocks Mountains of Cape Town, which I published in 2004. And it's obviously, well, it's been 12 years, a dozen years. And I really enjoyed the summer school originally, and I'm looking forward to doing it again with you now for this week. And I hope you'll enjoy what I have to present. This series of 5 lectures will be based on the latest book that I've just published on human origins. And I'll describe to you a little bit more about this book in terms of where to get it if you're interested. But just to say that this lecture is based on this book, but we won't have time to go into all of it and all of its details, so I've tried to pick out 5 major topics that I think will help introduce you to some of the major concepts that are presented in more detail in the book. So let's just start with the objective, what I hope to try to get across, and also the 5 lectures that will be presented this week. The main objective for me is to try to give you some of the latest scientific information about our understanding of human origins. There's been a huge amount of new science that's become available, both in terms of DNA studies, but also in terms of archaeological discoveries. And many of you would be familiar with those in southern Africa, with Homo naledi, Australopithecus sediba, and also the Blombos and Pinnacle Point cave sites, which have revealed a lot of new information about when and where humans were living and what they were up to. And what I hope to do basically in this course is to give you an overview of some of those key features and to throw in a specific emphasis on southern Africa. and really South Africa specifically, in the sense of what we'll see in terms of why I think it's important, the important role that Southern Africa played in human evolution. Okay, so we'll start today with the title of Big History, All Life is One. I want to give you this deeper perspective, this deep time perspective to start with, so you have an understanding of how we fit in to the big picture. Humans have only really been around for a brief moment of time compared to our total understanding of time since the Big Bang. And I think that's a big history that's important to grasp, or try to grasp. I struggle with it myself, even though I've been in the field for 30 years, this sense of deep time. But the big lesson that we get from going all the way back and putting it all in that deep perspective is around life in general, and the fact that we as humans are just one, of course, of many species on Earth, both that have lived in the past and that are living today. And that's the real big take-home message I want to get across in today's lecture, is the fact that if we look at big history and the long time spans from which animals evolved and then we eventually evolved, we get a better sense of the fact that humans are not separate from other life. We're actually very much a part of it. And I'll try to exemplify that in today's lecture. And then in the second lecture, I want to talk about how our lineage, our human lineage, evolved in response to major changes in the global system. So as Francois Peterson mentioned, one of my interests is in paleoclimates, climates of the past, and how those may have influenced people in particular. And that will be another major theme that I'll try to emphasize, is the importance of past climate change in creating what is essentially a very unsettled world, and in which our ancestors were continually pressed to find new solutions. Third lecture will be African cradle, where and how did our species Homo sapiens evolve? So in the third lecture, I'll try to focus in specifically on our species, latest species of Homo sapiens, and talk about, we evolved in Africa, but where might that have been in Africa? Obviously, I'm going to hedge for Southern Africa, as you'll see, and what might have been the mechanism by which our species finally evolved, and how might that have happened? That's rather speculative, but I think it's kind of interesting speculation, or I hope you'll get some ideas from that. Then once our species evolved, the fourth lecture is going to be about how did our species acquire culture? Culture, of course, is a major part of what it means to be modern humans. So part of what I'm going to try to do in lecture 4 is show you what is the evidence, and a lot of this comes from South Africa, as I mentioned, Blombos and Pinnacle Point Caves, of what were the earliest evidence of modern cultural thinking and production of tools and abstract art. And then in addition to that will be the aspect of when our species went global, when it left Africa and basically took over the world. And then finally, on the fifth lecture, I want to introduce the concept of the human superorganism, which is not like a Superman. It's just the ability of humans to work together to create civilizations, and in their cooperative social structures and governments to be able to get to where we are today, which is over 7 billion of us on a very sophisticated, civilization-wise viewpoint, and sort of understanding how did that happen, and specifically, where are we going? So a little bit of a look into the future. Is it sustainable? Is our world sustainable? What are the potential problems that lie ahead, and how might those be addressed? So that'll be sort of the final lecture. Okay, so let's get started on big history. Oh no, before I get started on big history, let me just logistically mention a few things. I'm very happy to answer questions. with a group this size, it can kind of interrupt the flow of what I'm trying to say. So if you do have a question, that's great. What I would ask is that if you'd like, maybe hold on to it and present it to me on a piece of paper. You can email it to me, and I will address it at the start of the next lecture. But if you're really dying to ask a question, please raise your hand. That's not a problem. The second logistical thing is, as I mentioned, this book has just come out in November. It was printed. It's basically a book that I wrote and put together myself and published myself. And you have a number of options if you're interested in reading it. The first of which is the cheapest one, is you can borrow it from the UCT library. Okay, so at short loan at the UCT library, just go there and tell them you're doing summer school. They have it, and you can loan it from the desk and read it. Another option is you can purchase it as either a paper copy or an ebook if you're into ebooks. And to do that, you can go to my website, johnscompton.com, and there on the buy page, it's given on your summer school outline, the link. You can order it from there as a paper book, or you can go and see the various ebook options. It's available as a Kindle, it's available as a PDF, it's available as a reflowable text-only format. So you can decide which one you like. You can select that and get it that way. It's also available from the Department of Geological Sciences, where I am housed. That's on Upper Campus, and they sell it there from the office. And finally, Clark's and Bay Books are here at summer school, and they have copies, and you can buy it directly from them. Or if you're a Botanical Society member, it's for sale at the Kirstenbosch through them, as well as Cock Bay Books, Protea Bookshops, and several others in town. So there are a number of different places you can find it and purchase it, and that's the book. Okay, so human origins, big question. How did we get here? I had an interesting incident when I took the book to the UCT library for the short loan before this course. There was a security guard there, and he looked at the title, and he saw the front cover, and he said, "Oh, human origins. That sounds interesting." He said, "Is it true that we came from fish?" And his colleague, overhearing him, said, "We didn't come from fish." He said, "God made us." End of story. And I was sort of stunned because I was just delivering these books, and just seeing the title had generated this response. And I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. And I said to the one guy, I said, "Yeah, it's true, we did come from fish." I said, "A long time ago, but our great ancestors were fish." And he said, "Well, that's amazing." And the other guy said, No, we're from God, and God created everything, and he even created the guy who wrote that book." And I said, "Well, that's me," and I said, "I hope you'll both read it, because I think you'll both hopefully get something out of it." But it did remind me that I did want to start by sort of explaining at least my personal view on this, because it comes up a lot, this issue around science and religion. And what I just want to say is that the lectures I'm going to give you are based on science, okay? And science is one way to approach the question of why are we here, or how did we get here? And I will try to explain that to you in the sense of this happened, that happened, and this happened, and then maybe this happened, whatever, okay? But there's another aspect to the question of why we're here, and that's a deeper question. Maybe it have to do with, to what purpose are we here, or for what reason do we exist? And those are sorts of questions that science can't really answer, at least not yet. So I just say that there are two different ways in which humans can try to answer or understand the question, why are you here? And I think they're both legitimate, they're both valuable, and depending on your own personal beliefs and your own personal situation, I leave that to everyone to decide how they want to deal with that. But I'm not, in presenting the science side, trying to convince you not to believe in God or anything, nothing of the sort. I appreciate that there are other aspects to understanding or answering that question, and I'll just leave it at that, just to make that clear. Okay, so let's start by what do I mean by big history? Sometimes referred to as deep time. It's a concept I'm very familiar with in geological sciences because that's what geology is about. It's about the Earth, and the Earth is very old, and therefore we deal with deep time all the time. And I guess historians have taken on the word big history. And as far as I can understand, history is about people who lived in the past. Now, written history only really extends back about 5,000 years. And the amount of history, in terms of the number of people, has increased, right? More of us, more people, more history. And if we consider it about being about people. But big history specifically refers to all the time sort of before people, or really before modern people, before we have written history. And that can go right back to the beginning of time as far as we can understand it, which is the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, okay? And in this course, big history refers to those key events, specifically more to those key events through deep time that led up to our arrival. All right, that's going to be the emphasis. There's a lot of other aspects of big history that aren't really relevant to our arrival, but that will be the emphasis in this course. So as an example, here's a bit of history that many of you may be familiar with, the British royal family tree. And we all have family trees, right? We can all make them. So in the sense of where you come from or how you got here, the most immediate answer is, well, my parents made me, right? That's where you came from. And their parents made your parents, and so on. So in history, we commonly think of family trees and lines of descent. And we can also think about that in terms of much deeper trees. And here's an example of a very deep tree, a part of the tree of life in the case of animals, okay? And the point of this tree is that here's a time scale here. It's in millions of years ago. So it starts at the base at 750, goes up to 440 million years ago. And it encapsulates this key event, which I'll come back to later, which is referred to as the Cambrian explosion. And it's a time period in Earth history that's fascinating because it's when animals rapidly proliferated into the many different forms that we see today. So each of these little cone-shaped things can be thought of as these different major groups called phyla. Along here, we belong to the chordates, and that's an early protochordate there. I'll mention that character a little bit later. But the point being that all of these animal forms that we know of today on Earth and that we can study right back through the past, they originated in this very explosive period in Earth history when they first appear, at least first appear to us in the fossil record. And what's interesting is they all appear to trace back to a common ancestor, this protozoa. I don't know how well you can see it. It's a chanoflagellate type organism. It's a single cell animal with a little flagellum to move around with and so forth. And that is believed to have formed the first sponges that then evolved into the first jellyfish type creatures that then eventually evolved into the many different, what we call bilateral animals. So this would be an example, and it's in many ways corresponds to what we understand about a family tree, that you can trace your descent, right, through time. So you have your parents, and they had their parents, and so on and so on. In the same way, we can take an animal, human or other, and we can trace its descent through time, through tracing its ancestors through this deep geological history. Now, this goes back, as I mentioned, around 500 million years, so that's pretty deep. But as we'll see, even the first origins of life were much, much deeper, about 4,000 million years, okay, 4 billion years. So in fact, life as a whole started much, much earlier, soon after Earth formed, actually. and has progressively diversified and been modified through these lines of descent through time. And what the emphasis of the book and this lecture is on is our descent through the subphylum of vertebrates, okay? And I'll give you a brief overview of that in today's lecture. Okay, so to put it in perspective, I've shown you this plot here of the time scale. This is just off the screen here a little bit, but that's the Big Bang at 13.8. And if you take that vertical scale right up, there's the present day at the top. So for much of that time, we had the Big Bang, and there was no Earth. There was no solar system. Our solar system entered the picture about here, 4.56 billion years ago. And as I mentioned, life got a relatively early start at about 4 billion years ago. And then for much of this time, leading up to the 500 million year event that I just mentioned, life was relatively simple. Unicellular organisms, bacteria and protozoa and so forth. And in the last 500 million years, which is shown in this next column, which many of you will recognize as having the famous geological periods on it, the Cretaceous, Jurassic, and so forth, that's when all the animals diversified up until the present day. And then if we blow up the last about 3 million years, we're into this period of the Pleistocene, and we see this period through here, and then we blow up the last 450,000 years, which is shown in this column here, and the last 5,000, there's our written history, okay? So it's really just the blink of an eye that we've had that written history. It's even a very short period of time since we've had our species Homo sapien, between around 200 and 100,000 years ago. And human origins can be traced back to about 5 or 7 million years, and complex animals, as I mentioned, back to about 500 or 600 million, and the earliest fossil evidence of life on Earth, 4,000 million. So it puts it in perspective that we as humans have been here for a very short time compared to the entire existence of Earth, and certainly since the time of the Big Bang. This shows it a little bit better. Here's the cosmic singularity, which was the Big Bang. Here is this expansion of the universe in relation to that Big Bang, and this is where we are now, and the universe continues to expand and move forward. And one of the main features here during this period of expansion was that we went from a chemically very simple universe of just hydrogen and helium to a much more chemically complex system through the synthesis of heavier elements in the formation of massive stars and supernovas. So in that sense, you are, in fact, stardust, as you maybe have heard. And that is represented here by these columns of gas and dust from a supernova called the Eagle Nebula. These columns are 1 light year in height. They were photographed by the Hubble telescope, NASA Hubble telescope. And you can see within them the nascent stars that are starting to form as this explosive material, gas and dust, start to condensate and form solar systems. And that's the idea that our own solar system probably formed from a similar event about 4.56 billion years ago. And out of that, a specific region of it caused the condensation of the gases to form our sun, and the planetary bodies formed from the dust and gases that were around it. Okay. So what we understand is that 4.56 billion years ago, Earth had formed initially in such a scenario. And initially, Earth would have been without life. It would have been too hot to have sustained life, because after all, it was probably started out as a magma ball, okay? A ball of molten rock. And it slowly started to cool, and it started to crust over. But during its early history, what's referred to as the Hadean for a hellish sort of Hades time, because Earth was constantly getting bombarded by incoming meteorites and asteroids and so forth, and these were of large enough and frequent enough impacts to make the Earth essentially uninhabitable, at least certainly as by life as we know it. But we also know from the fossil record, and here's an image here of a transparent slice of rock from a chert, which shows you some of the physical evidence for the earliest life forms, this sort of string of unicellular organisms. And the earliest evidence for life is centered around 4 billion years ago. So you can see that was near the end of the Hadean Eon, when the amount of material coming in and disrupting the system had died down, and Earth had become a habitable planet, existing within what's called the habitable zone, a distance from our star, our sun, that allowed for the existence of liquid water. So that's the early history of life, and this is an idea of what the Earth would have looked like if you were around 4 billion years ago. Basically, it would have had a lot of things very similar to us. It would have had large amounts of ocean, would have had an incipient start of continents, volcanism, would have had thunderstorms, lightning, but it would have had an unusually large moon, because the moon had only recently been made and was much closer to us, has since been retreating. And we would have had more material coming in from space than we do, a lot more shooting stars. And it would have been more twilight-like, because the sun was only 30% as luminous as today. But it was in this early stages of Earth that the heavy bombardment had finished, and it was possible for life, if it was going to get started. And the origin of life still remains a mystery, in the sense that we haven't been able to synthesize the reactions that make life. We know that in the early Earth, there were many organic compounds, many of them, such as amino acids, existed, and were able to make amino acids in the lab. What remains very mysterious about the origins of life is how did these original organic compounds manage to come together to form self-replicating, metabolizing living entities. That has remained quite a big unknown. But the idea is that if you have a chemistry like we have on Earth, and you have sources of energy, as we have on Earth, and receive from the sun, and you have time, that the idea is you will, appears, at least in this one case we know of, did end up with life forms. And those life forms have evolved ever since through the history of the Earth. So if we take this ribbon of time, deep time, there's our Big Bang at 13.8 billion years ago. And at some stage, we had a supernova that created Earth and our solar system. We had a very fiery, hellish Hadean initial stage. And then soon after that, life appears to have originated on Earth. And we have fossil and chemical evidence that that is what appears to be the case. And since then, following this ribbon through time, life has increased in terms of its diversity and abundance. And one of the reasons why we consider from this deep history that all life is one is that it all is based on similar chemistry, starting with the DNA molecule. Every cell contains in its nucleus around 1.7 meters of DNA, tightly coiled in our case in chromosomes. And all life forms, outside of some viruses which run on RNA, depend on DNA. And in addition, there are many biological reactions, synthesis protein reactions, enzyme reactions, of which there are many, many possible enzymes and proteins that are shared by all organisms. And all of this suggests that all of the life forms that we're familiar with today are descended from a last common ancestor in the past that was the first to be able to replicate using the DNA and RNA system. Where might this first life have formed? It's thought to have formed in the sea, and a good likelihood that's believed today to be possible is from a black smoker. Black smokers are a common name for hydrothermal vents spewing out hot, reduced fluids out of the oceanic crust from the hydrothermal heating up of seawater and then spewing it out through these vents. Here you can see a photo of one of these vents with a whole community, quite a rich community of organisms that are living in this system. And what's interesting about this one is it's in the pitch black bottom of the sea. So it's not run on photosynthesis as we're used to with plants. It's run on chemosynthesis, which is chemical reactions and the energy that they release. And if you go along these mid-ocean ridge systems, and you can see the world's ocean has a lot of mid-oceanic ridge activity associated with plate tectonics, there are many such black smokers in today's oceans, and there were presumably many of those in the early stages of Earth as it started to form. Okay, so the details of exactly how life may have formed in these black smoker systems is still very much being researched, not entirely understood. But there's a lot of interesting chemistry going on in there, and there's a lot of simple bacteria called archaea that are living there that were probably are thought to be the earliest forms of life. And where do we see those in the fossil record? We tend to find them in these beautifully layered, what are called cherts. They're like a sedimentary deposit that formed near those black smokers. And if you cut these into thin slices, this one is from our fig tree group in Barberton. So for those of you who visited Barberton, beautiful region on the other side of South Africa, there are some of the oldest rocks in the world, 3.4 billion years old. There are other equivalently aged rocks in Australia, which of course we're always competing with to try to see who has the better fossils or better rugby team or whatever with Australia. But if you look at those fossils, these ones happen to be from Australia. Sorry, but there are similar ones to these in South African cherts. And these are the physical evidence for some of the earliest life forms. And there was also recent discovery in Greenland of also very old stromatolite structures, which I'll mention. And the idea is that these thin slices of this previous rock of chert, these thin slices contain these microorganisms as the initial bacteria, and they're thought to be similar to simple bacteria, like here's Streptococcus, here's E. coli, you maybe have heard of those, in which case we have quite a simple form of life, bacterial or archaic form of life, with the DNA there in the middle and a cellular wall, and sometimes a flagellum. So, but what's interesting is, if these are 4 billion years old, it means all the complexity, much of the complexity of life had been established really quite early on in Earth history. And the process of life is very complicated, and I greatly simplify it here with this diagram of there's one of your chromosomes. If you unwind it, there's the DNA packed into your chromosome. On that DNA, you have a sequence that codes for a gene, a specific gene, that then get transcribed through messenger RNA, through a ribosome, and eventually end up with a protein, in this case, hemoglobin. So you are made up of proteins, right? From your hair to your skin to your blood to your, all that stuff is made, and it's all generated through your cells in the process of life. And I won't go into that, obviously, it's very complicated, but my point being that even the earliest, simplest life 4 billion years ago had much of this complex biochemistry going on within it, okay? And some of those very early biochemical processes still happen in us, okay? Within our cells, there are biochemical pathways that are nearly identical to what's going on in those archaeobacteria that live in the Mid-Eastern ridges. So that's part of the evidence also that connects us to this deep source of life and the fact that all life is one. I mentioned stromatolites briefly. This is what they look like. This is stromatolite, domal stromatolites in Australia. We don't have them in South Africa, or not in this extent anyhow. They're quite rare today, but they used to be very prolific. And in South Africa, we have a lot of fossil evidence of stromatolites, as shown here. And you can section these, and what you see is that they're mounds of growth of layers, layer upon layer. And the idea is that the living layer on the top had all this filamentous bacteria, and it grew on there. Here's some fossil, what are thought to be fossil representations of those. And those obviously worked by photosynthesis. They had arrived at the Earth's surface and through sunlight produced their organic matter and made that material. So if we look at the concept then, is the idea is that at 4 billion or earlier, we had a last common, universal common ancestor to every life form that now lives on Earth, including us. And that for many billions of years, that life form stayed relatively simple in the sense that it was made of one cell, unicellular, okay, like a bacterium. But that through that time period, the cell became more complex. So we started with a very simple, what's called prokaryotic cell, quite small and very basic. And we went to a larger, more complicated cell, which is known as a eukaryote. And the eukaryote basically has a lot of organelles or functions within it that are adapted from the incorporation of other bacterium within the prokaryotic cell. So this is called endosymbiosis. So through a process of endosymbiosis, a mutual beneficial relationship was established as these two joined up, and they eventually became incorporated within the cell, became a permanent feature, and these we know as like mitochondria within our cells, and the algal cell has the process through photosynthesis through its organelles, chloroplast organelles. So in this way, and this is an important theme in the history of life on Earth, it wasn't always about competition, although there is, of course, competition among living organisms, but it was also about cooperation very early on. And this is a very powerful example of that cooperation that led to a more complex life form. In this case, still a unicellular organism, but one which is much more complex in terms of the division of labor within the cell among different organelles and different aspects of it. So briefly then, just to summarize where we've gotten so far, is that the Earth formed a little over 4.5 billion. The idea is that you had these organic compounds naturally around. They somehow started to self-replicate in such a way that you eventually developed molecules as complex as RNA and DNA and all the enzymes that go into those, and that you eventually arrived at a last universal common ancestor, which was probably something like an archaea or a bacteria, a simple prokaryote. That simple prokaryote then, through quite a long history, this is several billion years, so here we are at 2 billion years, and we have the evolution of the more complex eukaryotic cells. And then from 2 billion, that then diversified into the algae, which would eventually evolve into all the plants and the fungi. And the protozoa went through, and as I mentioned earlier on, this cyanoflagellate, a protozoan, eventually diversified into multicellular organisms like sponges, and eventually all the animals that we know of that live today. So one of the interesting questions in this timeline is, why did it take so long for complex animals to arrive? If we had all this time and life got a very early start, what was the delay in the arrival of animals. And the most common explanation for that is that animals like us breathe in, need oxygen, right? We're very dependent on a high metabolic rate through the burning of oxygen, which is an extremely efficient way to make energy. So one of the ideas is that prior to this time, the oxygen level within the Earth's atmosphere was simply too low, and that animals who couldn't, like us, could not exist without that oxygen. So there seems to be a fairly good correlation between the onset of a higher oxygen content in the atmosphere and the earliest complex multicellular animals that arrived at about between 600 and 500 million years ago. And that since that time, oxygen then increased significantly and has remained ever since high, relatively high. And it's that high oxygen concentration in the Earth's atmosphere that is thought to be responsible for the ability for this proliferation, this Cambrian explosion, which I reproduce here. This proliferation is thought to result in large part because at that time the oxygen had finally gotten high enough for animals to take off. Okay, so then we have this long lead-up time of increasing complexity in cellular structures, and then at around 500 million, oxygen's high enough, and the animals take off. And the animals take off, and they then form this final spiral here of the last 500 million years with all of these geological names of Cretaceous, Cenozoic, and so forth. And humans are only at this very tail end. And one of the powerful points that I want to make about the science is our ability to date the past. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of how these numbers are arrived at, but I just want you to appreciate the accuracy, precision now with which we're able to date events. So, for example, the Cambrian explosion was originally dated, about 570 million years. This was an update to 543. It's now dated to 541 plus or minus 1 billion years ago. Okay. The Permian mass extinction, a major mass extinction event, has now been dated to 252.28 plus or minus 0.08, if you believe that. But that's the idea that these numbers, here's the end Cretaceous that killed off the dinosaurs, 65 originally, now it's 66.02 million years. So our ability through a number of different techniques to date when things happened has improved hugely. And that's critical to any story, right? To any story, the timing is really important because you have to really want to know when something happened relative to something else as precisely as you can, because that's going to influence your interpretation for sure. So if we go through this spiral, through all these organisms, I'm just going to take you briefly through that. We start with the Cambrian explosion. And remember, that's when I said everything got its start. Every major body plan of every animal that exists today, that's ever existed, started here. This was the start for everyone. And so that's when all the different ones started. If you went back to the Cambrian 500 million years ago and you went snorkeling or scuba diving, what you would observe is that all the life was in the sea. Okay? That's where life started. And you would have seen some weird organisms like Analommacaris, this one here, which was quite large and a predator. Mariella here, there's swimming about. This was Hallucinogenia, which had weird tube-like legs and spikes on its back for protection. Here's a smaller one. Of course, the sponges had already been around. The sponges came first. And then here's this one, Pikaia, which is called a protochordate, and is one of the earliest members of our phylum, the chordates. And let's look at some other ones from some amazing fossil records. These are the ones from China. And this is the fossil here. This is the reconstruction of what the organism looked like. And here's a more labeled diagram showing you the dorsal fin, what's thought to be the nodal cord, which would be the precursor to our backbone, the muscle blocks, the intestines, gill pouches, etc. And here's a modern-day lancelet, sometimes referred to as amphioxus, with similar structures. So the idea is that our earliest ancestors, here's Picaia, here, gracilans, here's Metaspringia, another one. The idea is that our earliest animal ancestor is related to a fish-like organism, such as these. And these are the early chordates, sometimes referred to as the protochordates, because they have a very simple nodal cord for a backbone. And the idea is that we did evolve through fish, that our descent was via these fish-like Cambrian chordates, and that through a whole series of jawless, and then ones that developed jaws, and then ones that became bony rather than cartilaginous, and then eventually forming the ray-finned fish and then the lobe-finned fish, through this Devonian period it's often referred to as the age of fish, because there was this huge diversification in the world's oceans in the types of fish. And some of these old relics are still around, like the lamprey and the hagfish are examples of thought to be representative of these very early jawless type fish that still exist today. The sharks and rays are examples from the cartilaginous fish. And the teleus fish, very diverse group, are representative of these ray-finned fish. And then the lobe-finned fish is the famous coelacanth, which we know from South Africa from its early discovery here in 1938. They were long thought to be extinct since the Cretaceous, but they were rediscovered live off of PE, or East London. And the lungfish. And these two are some of the few remaining of the lobe-finned fish, but we're particularly interested in them because the lobe-finned fish appear to be, perhaps particularly the lungfish, our ancestor that then went out of the sea and onto dry land to become the tetrapods of the amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. So the idea is that for various reasons, these early lobe-finned fish were driven out of the ocean, perhaps because the water became too toxic from lack of oxygen, or they were drawn out by the earlier movement of plants onto land, and with them insects. So these guys probably realized, hey, there's a lot of food out there that nobody's eating. So they were perhaps partly pulled out and became the first amphibians. And this is quite a neat transition from about 385 million years ago to 365, so just 20 million years. These fossils suggest that these lobe fins were reformulated through changes in the structure into the limbs, and with, in this case, many digits, and also more digits there. But eventually, the first amphibians came ashore, and eventually those 4 limbs all ended in 5 digits. Okay. Now, occasionally, someone's born with an extra digit, but most of us end up with 4 limbs and 5 digits at the end. And that's reflective of this history of the movement of fish out of the sea and into the first amphibians. So if you went back to the Carboniferous, you would see there's our great ancestor, the amphibian, on a log with lots of vegetation, and there's a super big dragonfly up to about 70 centimeters across. And the idea is that this lush tropical Carboniferous forest gave rise to lots and lots of oxygen, and lots of oxygen allowed for things like dragonflies, huge dragonflies, to exist. And then the amphibians evolved into reptiles, and a particular group of reptiles called the therapsids, or mammal-like reptiles, evolved soon after the Permian mass extinction that I mentioned earlier at 252 million years ago. And they diversified into these cynodonts, which were, sort of dog-sized. They started to raise their bodies up off the ground a bit more onto their 4 limbs. Some of them were smaller in size, like eventually forming like Morganodon up here. And the idea is that you had these early mammal-like reptiles that evolved in the Triassic. And South Africa, the paleontological record from the Karoo is very rich in these fossils. And much of our understanding of the evolution of our early transition from reptiles to mammals comes from the Karoo Basin. And at this time, of course, this was also the time of the rise of the reptiles in the form of dinosaurs, such that it was really a dinosaur world in the sense that all the large-bodied animals were dinosaurs. And mammals, these little guys here, were small and highly diverse in terms of what they could do, but none of them were very large. They were kept small by these carnivorous, nasty dinosaurs. But as we all know, eventually, a meteorite struck the Yucatan area, the present-day Yucatan, and basically wiped out the dinosaurs. That was the end of Cretaceous mass extinction. And what's interesting about that event is what this diagram shows you. Here's the Triassic to the Jurassic, Cretaceous, and the Paleogene. And what this shows you is that you have a huge diversity of mammalian forms during this Jurassic Cretaceous period. Now, the dinosaurs ruled the Earth at that time. All of these mammalian forms were small, but some dug holes, some flew like this flying squirrels, some swam like beavers, some whatever. They had many different adaptations to different types of life form. And equally interesting is that almost all of them also went extinct. Okay? But fortunately, not all of them went extinct for us. As with the dinosaurs, they also almost all went extinct, but of course not the birds, right? So the birds are the leftovers from the dinosaurs that got through this major cataclysmic event and have crossed over and diversified into the wonderful birds. The placental mammals crossed over, and the marsupials crossed over, and platypus in the form of monotremes also crossed over. Okay, so those are the mammals that made it through. But it's important to realize that in these mass extinction events, many diverse forms went extinct. And then in the recovery, post the major impact event, certain ones were more successful than others. And as we all know, the placental mammals in particular were extremely successful. And they proliferated to form the large life forms, elephants, rhinos, giraffes, humans, the big cats, and so forth. Okay? So they allowed the mammals to essentially take over from the dinosaurs, who were left to be the birds. And this artist's rendition is what is thought after the Cretaceous extinction event. This is what's thought to be are all of the mammals' ancestors. Okay? Came from something that looked like this, kind of like a rat with good little specialized teeth, probably an insectivore, lived during the day, and yeah, that's our great, whatever, grandfather, mother. But it would diversify, right? It would diversify into this whole amazing number of mammals, including humans, and the great apes, and the primates, and rodents, and cows, dolphins, dogs, cats, birds, moles, elephants, all of them. And of our particular interest is the primate family tree, because it's from that tree that we evolved. So soon after the Cretaceous, well, not that soon, about 10 million years after the Cretaceous, we have a fossil of this guy. This is an artist's rendition. He was just a small little monkey-like creature that lived in the forest, but definitely looked like him. He had a very long tail. And that this one then evolved into the lemurs, the lorises, the tarsiers, the New World and old world monkeys, and then around 23 million years ago, broke away the apes. And the apes is the family tree to which we belong. And so from the Miocene, 23 million years ago, we have the old world monkeys, the baboons, the lesser apes, the gibbons, greater apes, the orangutans, which are in Asia. And then in Africa, the gorillas, the chimps and bonobos, which are closely related, and then humans. And so what this shows us is that over these millions of years, the ape family tree diversified, and we're most closely related to the bonobos and chimpanzees, with whom we share an ancestor about 9 or 6 million years ago, which doesn't mean that we evolved from chimpanzees. It means that we share an ancestor with them that lived sometime between 9 and 6 million years ago. And that at this juncture, one group diverged into our lineage of humans, and the others carried on as chimps, and eventually they broke up in between bonobos and chimpanzees. And earlier, we shared a common ancestor with the gorillas, the orangutans, and back, right the way back to the first life form, Luca, the last universal common ancestor, about 4 billion years ago. So it's possible, and I've done it very quickly here, but I just wanted to give you an overview of it. It's very possible now to trace that very deep descent from the first successful replicate life forms based on DNA right the way through to the great apes. And then what we're going to do in tomorrow's lecture is I'm going to talk specifically about this section right here of our breakaway from the great apes in our own lineage of humans. And I think the lesson to take from this big history, this deep history, is this quote from John Updike's introduction to Rabbit Angstrom, quote, "We forget most of our past, but embody all of it." Now, I think in his sense, he was speaking to Rabbit Angstrom, for those of you familiar with the book. But in a way, we can extend that to our deep history and think about, okay, in your body, every cell has DNA. That DNA is the same basis of every animal that lives on Earth. We start in our fetal skeleton with a cartilaginous skeleton. That's reminiscent of our Cambrian ancestors. That then becomes a bony skeleton, which is reminiscent of our Ordovician first bony fish. We have 4 limbs ending in 5 digits, just like all the other animals of tetrapod animals, and that derives from the Devonian amphibians. We have waterproof skin, which we evolved from the reptiles of the Carboniferous. We have hair on our skin, and we have warm-bloodedness, and that's from Jurassic mammals. We have front-facing eyes. We have flat fingernails, and we have a big brain, and that we can attribute initially to the Paleogene first primates. And then our tail has been also reduced to a coccyx bone and our tailbone, and we have very flexible shoulders for primates, which we attribute to our Miocene apes. So a lot of the features about us, both in terms of very complex chemistry that's happening in each one of your cells at this very moment, to the overall aspects of your morphology, the way your body's shaped, can be traced through this long lineage of